Barbora Skrlová, the orphan. This is one of the most bizarre and disturbing criminal stories in modern Europe. Occurring in 2007 in the Czech Republic, it became known as the worst case of child abuse in the country's history. Similar to the character of Esther in the movie The Orphan, the real protagonist of this story is Barbora Skrlová, a woman who at 33 years old was posing as a girl of just 12 years. Barbora Skrlová was born in 1973 in former Czechoslovakia during a period when the country was still under communist rule. The daughter of a psychiatrist, she grew up in an environment that paradoxically was unable to identify the early signs of her behavioral disorders. From a young age, Barbora demonstrated a peculiar and complex personality with difficulties socializing and a tendency toward isolation. Her childhood was marked by a physical appearance that always made her look younger than she really was, a characteristic that would later become central to her manipulation schemes. Growing up in the context of the Cold War in Eastern Europe, Barbora experienced the political and social tensions that would culminate in 1989 with the Velvet Revolution and the end of Soviet domination in Czechoslovakia. This period of transition and social instability may have contributed to shaping her distorted worldview and her ability to adapt to different identities as needed. Barbora Skrlová suffered from a rare medical condition called hypopituitarism, a hormonal disorder that prevents normal physical development of the body. Due to this condition, even at 33 years old, she appeared to be a child of just 12 years. During much of her childhood and youth, Barbora was institutionalized in hospitals and psychiatric clinics due to her rare condition, which contributed to the development of aggressive and obsessive behaviors. Specialists who later analyzed her stated that she exhibited characteristics of sociopathy. Taking advantage of her childlike appearance, Barbora frequently posed as a child, manipulating people and situations to her advantage. This capacity for manipulation would become the central element of one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent European history. During adolescence, Barbora already showed signs of emotional instability and manipulative behaviors. Despite her above-average intelligence, which allowed her to excel academically when she applied herself, her school trajectory was irregular, marked by periods of absence and conflicts with classmates and teachers. Accounts from people who lived with her during that time describe an introverted young woman with occasional outbursts of anger and a disturbing ability to lie convincingly. Her youthful appearance, combined with a below-average height, began to establish itself as a distinctive trait that would later be fundamental in her deception schemes. Even at this stage, Barbora demonstrated a remarkable ability to manipulate others' perceptions, alternating between childish behaviors and a calculating maturity that confused those around her. In the early 1990s, with the Czech Republic newly formed after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, Barbora entered adulthood in a country undergoing profound political, economic, and social transformations. This period of her life remains partially obscure to biographers and investigators, but it is known that she briefly attended university where she studied psychology, knowledge she would later use to manipulate vulnerable people. Her studies in the field, though incomplete, provided her with tools to understand and exploit human frailties. During this period, Barbora began to exhibit behavioral patterns suggesting more serious personality disorders, including elaborate mythomanias and a disconcerting ability to assume different identities. Partially disclosed medical records indicate that Barbora underwent psychiatric evaluations during this period, receiving diagnoses that included personality disorder with histrionic and antisocial traits. However, her ability to manipulate even mental health professionals frequently resulted in inconsistent or incomplete diagnoses. People who lived with her during this time report episodes in which Barbora completely assumed fictional personalities, maintaining them consistently for weeks or months, only to abruptly abandon them. This capacity for transformation, combined with her persistent youthful appearance, began to become her trademark. By the end of the 1990s, Barbora had already developed a history of problematic interpersonal relationships marked by emotional manipulation and sudden abandonment when her lies threatened to be discovered. To fully understand this story, it's necessary to know the two sisters who became involved with Barbara, Klara and Katerina Mawarova. Klara, the older sister, had serious psychological problems. She believed she was destined to serve God, as if she had a divine mission on earth. She was already a single mother of two sons, Andrei, 8 years old, and Jakub, 10 years old, having been abandoned by her husband who couldn't deal with her psychological problems. Katerina, 7 years younger than Klara, also exhibited psychological disorders. From school, teachers had already warned about the sisters' strange behaviors, suggesting the possibility of mental disorders. When this happened, the girl's mother simply moved the family to another city to avoid questioning. There was even a rumor that, at 13 years old, Klara had attempted to kill her own sister by suffocating her with a pillow, believing she could resurrect her afterward with supposed divine powers. After losing their parents, the sisters inherited a mansion where they began living together with Klara's children. Katerina met Barbara at university, and they soon developed a close friendship. Under circumstances that were never fully clarified, Barbara ended up moving into the Mawarova sisters' mansion. Barbara's presence had a devastating effect on the sisters, managing to bring out the worst aspects of their already unstable personalities. She knew how to manipulate the sisters' religious tendencies, introducing them to a sectarian movement called Grail. From that moment on, the behavior of the three women deteriorated drastically. They stopped bathing, shaved their heads, began wearing only dirty clothes, and adopted increasingly bizarre behaviors. Barbara alternated between acting as a 12-year-old girl and as the adult woman she actually was. Barbara began to feel jealous of the attention Klara gave to her own children and started to sabotage them. She would break objects around the house and blame the children, creating situations to deteriorate the relationship between Klara and her sons. When the relationship was already compromised, Klara asked Barbara for advice on how to deal with her children. It was at this moment that Barbara suggested buying cages, saying the children needed to be disciplined. Klara, mentally unstable, accepted the suggestion. The cages were installed in the basement of the house. The children, Andrei and Jakub, were stripped naked and locked in the cages, where they lived the worst days of their lives. They couldn't leave to bathe or use the bathroom, being forced to relieve themselves inside the cages, living in inhuman conditions. The situation worsened when Barbara convinced Klara and Katerina to physically abuse the children. The little ones were brutally beaten whenever they cried or complained. They also suffered electric shocks, burns from cigarette tips, and waterboarding, a torture technique that consists of repeatedly submerging the victim's head in water. Barbara justified these atrocities by telling the sisters that the children were possessed by evil spirits and that the punishments were necessary to purify them. Taking advantage of the sisters' mental instability and distorted religious beliefs, she convinced them that those tortures were, in reality, a way to help the children. The horrors didn't stop there. At times, the three women would cut pieces of skin from the children using iron bars, and in disturbing acts of cannibalism, would even consume parts of their bodies. There are reports that, occasionally, they would mix parts of the children's bodies with wine and serve them at parties. What ended up saving the children was a technological accident. The women installed a surveillance camera in the basement to monitor the children 24 hours a day. What they didn't know was that a neighboring family had installed similar equipment in their own home. Due to some signal error, the images captured by the camera in the Mawarova sisters' basement began appearing on the neighbor family's monitor. Initially confused by what they were seeing, the neighbors took time to understand the situation. Only in May 2007 did they finally comprehend the gravity of what they were witnessing and called the police. The neighboring family accidentally captured disturbing images coming from the Mawarova family's apartment. The images showed one of Klara's biological sons, Andrei, 8 years old, being kept naked in an improvised captivity, subjected to torture and deprivation. The police were alerted, and upon investigating, the residents discovered not only the imprisoned boy, but also his brother Jakub, 10 years old, in similar conditions. When the police arrived at the mansion, they found the sisters in a state of hysteria, trying to prevent the authorities from entering. They were handcuffed and detained. Inside the house, the police discovered the basement with the cages where the two boys were imprisoned, covered in wounds and severely dehydrated. One of them was unconscious and the other in a state of shock. The most disturbing aspect was that near the cages, the police found an apparent young girl holding a stuffed animal with a fearful expression. The girl ran toward the police asking for help, saying her name was Annika and that she was Clara's adopted daughter. The police, believing she was another victim who showed no obvious signs of abuse, didn't pay much attention to her. The biggest surprise came when authorities realized that the supposed adopted daughter, Anichka, had mysteriously disappeared during the investigation. What no one suspected at that moment was that Anichka was in reality Barbora Skrlová, an adult woman who had taken advantage of her youthful appearance and psychological disorders to infiltrate the family and participate in the abuse. Taking advantage of the confusion during the police operation, Barbora managed to escape. After the investigations began in Kuzim, Barbora Skrlová quickly disappeared, leaving Czech authorities perplexed about her whereabouts. Demonstrating disturbing cunning, she fled to Norway where she assumed a new false identity. This time Barbora presented herself as Adam, a 13-year-old boy. Her capacity for transformation was so convincing that she managed to enroll in a Norwegian primary school, where she attended classes for months without raising significant suspicions. This period impressively illustrates her ability to adapt and manipulate, managing to deceive not only classmates, but also teachers and school authorities. Despite being 34 years old at the time, the charade only came to an end in January 2008, when Norwegian police, alerted by Czech authorities through Interpol, finally captured Barbora in Oslo. The moment of arrest was described as surreal by the officers involved, who found themselves confronting an adult woman who had meticulously constructed the identity of a pre-adolescent boy. After her capture, Barbora was extradited back to the Czech Republic to face charges related to the Kuzim case. Images of her arrest and extradition, showing a woman with a youthful appearance but clearly an adult, shocked international public opinion and brought to light questions about how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. Forensic psychologists who later analyzed the case suggested that Barbora possessed a rare combination of personality disorders that allowed her not only to deceive others, but also to completely immerse herself in the identities she created. Ellie. Juicio de Barbora Skrlová. The trial of Barbora Skrlová and the others involved in the Kuzim case became one of the most notorious in recent criminal history of the Czech Republic. During the judicial proceedings, which extended over several months, horrifying details of the abuse came to light. It was proven that the children Ondřej and Jakub were subjected to systematic torture, including beatings, burns, food deprivation, and confinement in inhumane conditions. Barbora's exact role in these abuses was the subject of intense debate. During the trial, while the prosecution portrayed her as an active participant and instigator of the mistreatment, her defense argued that she herself was a victim of manipulation by the cult led by the Mauerova sisters. The judicial hearings revealed the psychological complexity of the case. Forensic experts presented contradictory evaluations about Barbora's mental state, with some arguing that she suffered from severe disorders that compromised her capacity for discernment, while others described her as a conscious and calculating manipulator. Barbora's behavior during the trial only added layers to her enigmatic personality. At times, she appeared fragile and confused. At others, she demonstrated a disconcerting coldness. In October 2009, the court finally delivered its verdict. Barbora Skrlová was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the abuse. Klara and Kateřina Mauerová received more severe sentences of 9 and 10 years, respectively. Barbora's relatively brief sentence generated controversy in Czech public opinion, with many considering that she had received lenient treatment due to her ability to manipulate even the judicial system. Barbora Skrlová's period of incarceration remains partially obscure, with little official information disclosed about her behavior or adaptation to prison life. Sporadic reports from prison system officials suggest that she maintained a low profile during most of her sentence, although She occasionally attempted to manipulate other inmates and staff with elaborate stories about her past. Psychiatrists who followed her during this period reported difficulties in establishing a definitive diagnosis or effective treatment, given her tendency to provide contradictory information and her resistance to genuine therapeutic interventions. While Barbora served her sentence, the Kujim case and her bizarre participation in it began to penetrate global cultural consciousness. In 2009, director Jaume Collet-Serra released the psychological horror film Orphan, which, although not a direct adaptation of the case, was clearly influenced by Barbora's story. In the film, an adult woman with a rare medical condition that makes her appear to be a child infiltrates an adoptive family with sinister intentions. Despite significant differences between the film and the real case, the similarities were enough to establish connections in the public's mind. The film became a commercial and critical success, introducing elements of the case to audiences who might otherwise never have heard of Barbora Skrlová. This cultural influence only increased the morbid fascination surrounding her figure, transforming her into a kind of modern urban legend and symbol of a particularly disturbing type of deception. Barbora Skrlová was released from prison in 2014 after fully serving her 5-year sentence. Her exit from the Czech penitentiary system was discreet, without the intense media coverage that had characterized her trial. Since then, reliable information about her whereabouts and activities has become extremely scarce. Some unconfirmed sources suggest that she may have legally changed her name and appearance, seeking anonymity in a new region or country. Other reports indicate that she might have been committed to psychiatric institutions for continued treatment of her mental disorders, although no official confirmation of these rumors has been provided by Czech authorities. The absence of verifiable information about Barbora in recent years has created a void quickly filled by speculation and conspiracy theories online. In internet forums and social networks, unverified allegations of sightings or new criminal activities attributed to her periodically emerge, most of which lack any substantial evidence. Czech criminal law experts point out that if Barbora indeed opted for an anonymous life after her release, she would be legally entitled to do so, as long as she did not violate the terms of any parole or restrictions imposed by the court. The case remains one of the most intriguing and disturbing in recent European criminology, not only because of the horrible abuses involved, but because of the fundamental question that continues without a complete answer. Who, in the end, is Barbora Skrlová really beyond the multiple identities she assumed throughout the years? The case of Barbora Skrlová left a lasting legacy both in the Czech legal system and in global cultural consciousness. In the Czech Republic, the Kujim case led to significant reforms in child protection protocols and adoption procedures, with more rigorous background checks and closer monitoring of adoptive families. Forensic psychologists and criminologists continue to study the case as an extreme example of psychological manipulation and how personality disorders can manifest in elaborate criminal behaviors. Barbora's ability to exploit flaws in social and institutional systems exposed vulnerabilities that authorities in various countries have since worked to correct. In the cultural realm, in addition to influencing the film Orphan and its 2022 sequel One Orphan First Kill, the case inspired documentaries, books, and academic studies. Barbora's story became a reference point for discussions about identity, deception, and the limits of human perception. Psychiatrists who later analyzed the case suggested that Barbora represents a rare and extreme example of how personality disorders can manifest when combined with above-average intelligence and conducive social circumstances. Some specialists propose that she possessed a unique form of factitious disorder, in which the person not only feigns illnesses or conditions to obtain medical attention, but extends that fabrication to their complete identity. The story of Barbora Skrlová remains a disturbing reminder of the complexity of the human psyche and the disturbing extremes to which some individuals can go. Her case continues to fascinate and horrify precisely because it challenges our fundamental notions about identity, truth, and the limits of human manipulation. In a world increasingly concerned with issues of identity and authenticity, Barbora represents an extreme example of how these boundaries can be distorted and exploited. While her current whereabouts remain unknown, her impact on criminology, forensic psychology, and popular culture continues to reverberate, reminding us of the fragility of the social systems we have built and the constant need to protect the most vulnerable against those who, like Barbora, possess an extraordinary ability to exploit the flaws in those systems.